Hello, everyone. For this tiny desk lecture for my science communication class, we are going to be discussing relating in science communication, which is really dialoguing and not monologuing. Uh, we have a lot of stereotypes about science and communication, and there's often a lot of obstacles for scientists to convey their messages. So, whether you're the scientist who wants to learn more about communicating and relating, as a way to convey important information for public health or with colleagues or different communities so that they can have the latest information. Or if you're a communication major and you want to understand how to take scientific information and make it, because we often have to deal with science on our jobs, all a lot of jobs, even if you're not a scientist, we're getting information and we need to know how to communicate and report that out so we can do better at our jobs as well. Which is why when you listen to this week's chapter from Getting to the Heart of Science Communication by Faith Cairns, this chapter is really important because it's really looking at relating and crucial. I also made some optional articles from like workplace safety, because that's a big part of a lot of places is understanding the science around safe workplaces. We also want to understand science because we are managing our own stress levels, and there's a lot of incredible neuroscience information and psychology information about how to think about stress and understand stress, which is a whole thing about conveying information for health. And then, of course, there's climate change. And this week is also like, there's so many different ways to think about how we're relating in science with science and non-expert dialogues, the expert and the non-expert diet. So we're actually in a dialogue instead of a monologue. But we also want to think about politicians and the role of a representative individual, someone who's voted into office to represent a community. That person, when they are in a position where they can actually enact and create change for public health, that we want to understand the complexities of that as well. So to get to that, I bring the communication. So I definitely want to talk about influence and persuasion and rhetoric in this little tiny desk, and gave you some written information about that. I also want to, so that includes ethos and pathos and logos, but it also includes this linguistic idea of metaphors and analogies. We're really trying to coordinate and manage meaning and convey ideas. And the reason why you want to do that in a dialogue is that if someone just comes in with this is uh, how to look at this is the thing, and you're monologuing, then you don't know how it's being interpreted, if what you're trying to say is even coming across. We want to allow for questions. We want to allow for perception checking. We want to get through biases, whether explicit or implicit, so that when hopefully driving towards the purpose of creating sound policy, getting the proper information to the public, dealing with disinformation, and what is the difference between information coming from an expert versus a non-expert, and how we should be critically listening and comparing information across different fields, and so that we can be better consumers of scientific information for better health uh, and a better world, right? I mean, that's really what our hope is, whether it's civil engineering or computer science or neuroscience. All of these things are hopefully being engaged in a way to make us more aware of how to live a better life and make the world more sustainable over longer periods of time. I'm sure you could add something to that and what's driving that force. Often we are in the minutia of being busy or being driven towards consumer-driven goals that often um, become hierarchies to other purposes. And we're not really here to necessarily address all of that in just this one little video, but I'm just making a mention into it that we are dealing with a lot of forces of consumer habits and the fast-paced world that we're in that often makes us not have the time to really dialogue with information, but rather be either in a desperate attempt to get the information monologuing or just getting information washing over us without any really concrete tools to how to critically think about them. So when we are trying to convey something to convey meaning, we are now in the world of really tuning our ear into the linguistic approach of conveying information. And linguistically, we're talking about pragmatic meaning that we share a kind of cultural base knowledge. And from that cultural base knowledge, we build shared meaning through those things. But what if expert to non-expert, we don't have that pragmatic approach? Then we need to use other linguistic approaches, like being sure we're clear about our definitions, but clear about our definitions and using metaphor, analogies, or synecdoches. I mean, there's a lot of different linguistic tools that we have on hand to convey that information. Uh, so definitions. Definitions, we always, in science and in most research fields, uh, you are given a lot of definitions. In fact, when you're in undergrad in academic fields, you are given a lot of vocabulary, like in my class, but in other classes, especially at the beginner level, like if you're taking psychology 101 or computer science 101, there's a lot of definitions. And a lot of that is to get you into the jargon of semantic meaning. Semantic meaning the individual meaning of a word in relation to the context that we're using that word, right? So the semantic, that's like the word run. Run has a lot of different meanings depending on the context of that word. For example, you can run to the store, or you can run a red light, or you can go for a run, or you can run for office, and the list goes on. So all of these things means that the semantic meaning of the word run shifts and changes depending on the context that we're using that word and all the other words that we're using around it. So when we have jargon, scientific jargon, we want to make sure, because sometimes there's a word that the public uses it in a different way than the jargon way. And how do we convey a definition without sounding like Sheldon? Like, I'm going to tell you funny about that word that you're using. Here's the history of it. Here's the definition. When I use it, I mean it this way, right? Like, you don't want to get into like this kind of preachy teacher mode when you're trying to dialogue. You're trying to be in a conversation. So that means that you're going to want to, really engage in a conversational way and embed the meaning of that word, uh, whatever that jargon term you're using, or just perception check when someone's using jargon with you to ask them to clarify how they're using a word if you need to. And depending on the relating part of it, that should be an open dialogue to get that baseline. Um, and so that's kind of definitions, and we have to think about how we are using definitions and make not just making assumptions about the way people are using the word and not moving into preaching and allowing people to dialogue about it. Excuse me. Metaphors and analogies. In analogies, which I'm kind of asking you to do in our discussion board, is you're going to create an analogy and use metaphorical kind of language to convey a scientific idea. Uh, and so I'd like you to use an everyday object when you're doing that discussion board. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Let me get more into what I mean by analogy. There are literal analogies and figurative analogies. And the literal analogy is that when I take one thing and I'm going to compare it to another, an analogy is a comparison. I'm going to compare X to Y. So if I'm comparing X to Y, if I'm telling the story of X, then every point along the way, this is why, this is how Y is like X, X and Y and X and Y until you get to the piece that's different. And then that's the like punchline. However, this is different. And then you can really drive through a point that you're trying to make about why we need to pay attention to whatever it is we're trying to get our audience to understand. And so an analogy can work rhetorically to really engage your audience. And in fact, some of you in the last discussion board on kids and science, when you talked about Bill Nye or the Octopus Show. There was a bunch of Magic School Bus, that those shows were really trying to use analogies to engage kids in the world they know to learn about the world they don't know. And we need to learn how to do that with adults as well. A literal analogy is when I'm comparing two things. It's really an example that is uh, that is almost exactly the same. So if I was going to talk about earthquakes and I was using a literal analogy and I want to talk about the difference between plates that move horizontal to each other, I might make an analogy to earthquakes that move laterally to each other. And whether the plates are like this or the plates are like this, or are they moving up and down, or are they moving across? Uh, if I were to do that, that would be a more literal analogy because I'm comparing earthquakes to earthquakes, right? Or if I want to look at the geoscience of volcanic rocks, and I have a literal analogy, and I'm going to use obsidian rock to a different type of rock, a volcanic rock, the more porous one, which I'm forgetting the name of. Maybe I have some geoscience people out there who know what I'm talking about, but the volcanic rock that cools really fast compared to the one that slowly cooled so that it created a different texture. And I'm going to describe the cooling process of volcanic rock to create these two different types of rock, smooth and glass-like to something more porous, right? So that would be a literal analogy if I was going to compare those two rocks to each other. They're definitely not the same, but they are coming from the same processes. A figurative analogy is when I'm going to compare something to something that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. So if I were to go back to that volcanic rock that cools really slowly, and it's almost like Swiss cheese or a sponge. You can think of all the holes in it and the air pockets that form when rock cools smoothly. But a sponge or Swiss cheese is definitely nothing to do with the rock. And that would be a more figurative analogy. But if I talk about a sponge, almost everyone has had some experience with a sponge. And whether it's SpongeBob or an actual sponge you use, you kind of get an automatic visual that goes with it. And that's really what I'm looking for your discussion board, is for you to create this figurative analogy of one thing compared to another. Or if I wanted to do the obsidian fast cooling that's like glass, right? I already just even using word like glass is kind of, but maybe if I could talk about, oh, those kind of marble paperweights that are much smoother and shiny. And I'm trying to talk about a rock that's smooth and shiny, like that's like that type of volcanic rock that's instantly cool to create that shiny, smooth effect. And the snow or a snow globe, I don't know. So you see what I'm trying to do? That would be a figurative analogy. It gets so you these are really complex scientific ideas. And in your presentation, I'm not expecting you to give me the entire complex scientific idea. I want you to try and just say very concisely, this is how this can tell us more about this. And then the reason why I limit you to 2 or 3 minutes and I want you to speak concisely is because I want you to develop your extemporaneous or conversational skills and have you really convey an idea as if you were talking to your friend or you're in a conversation. I do not read. I want you to be engaged, and it's another reason why I'd like you to hold your object. Oh, maybe I could do it like a crystal. Here's a crystal. So I'm going to talk about the comparison of an obsidian rock to this crystal and its kind of multifaceted, shiny face. This is clear where obsidian is black, but we would maybe I would do it that way. And that's kind of what I'm looking for you to do is can you find an object to use in your video that you can get us to understand the thing you want us to understand? Uh, I had a student, and I love this example. This was years and years ago, but I had a student trying to explain the difference between adult stem cells and embryonic stem cells to convey how they're used in the medical field. And um, it was just informative. Sometimes this is an issue that can be really controversial, and this is why this is so powerful that you convey information without persuading, and using an analogy or metaphor can sometimes convey an idea past the controversial elements that come with it. But an adult stem cell and an embryonic stem cell, adult stem cells he compared it to a chessboard, and he said that's like a pawn on a chessboard. It can move, it can do some things, but it's really limited, and it's not that powerful for fighting the way that we want to use stem cells to fight disease and improve people's health or an injury. Uh, but an embryonic stem cell works kind of like the queen on a chessboard, that the queen can move in all different directions. It's pretty powerful and can take on any movement of any other piece. And that is the way that that student explained the difference between adult and embryonic stem cells. So that's just a really quick example of a very figurative analogy for a really complex topic. It definitely falls short of explaining the complexity of those ideas, but it's like a pathway in. And that's all I'm looking for. I'm just looking for, can you create an informative pathway in to understanding a scientific principle? And it doesn't have to be a complex one, right? It can be pretty a simple idea or a sub point to a much bigger point. Okay, so that's how analogies work, and uh, metaphors are kind of a little bit different in that they use a lot more language metaphorically to kind of expand the way we understand something. So, for example, if I were to say the brain, if I want to compare neuroscience and the way the brain works to a machine or a computer, right? That's often an analogy that's kind of more cliche. It's overused. It definitely doesn't describe the way a brain works, but it's often the analogy we hear. But then if I'm using that metaphorically, that metaphor, then I'm going to talk about my brain in like, oh, wow, brain is malfunctioning, or I can't download that right now, or my bandwidth is on overload, right? Like as soon as I start taking all these linguistic semantic words that are associated with a computer, and then I apply them to the way I'm feeling in my brain, that's kind of the way metaphors kind of invade an idea that we're trying to convey. I'd like you to avoid using similes in your presentation, but it's good to understand that similes are another type of comparison. And I just put it up on our Canvas board so you can understand that often they fall into cliches, like my brain is like a computer is a simile, and it kind of loses its rhetorical impact if it's overused and overdone. So I'm really challenging you to think a little bit more beyond a cliche that is already pervasive in the culture and try and find a new way to convey an idea. If you're kind of stuck on this, you can always contact me, but I'm not done with the video, but I'm almost done with the metaphor semantic piece that we were talking about. And also, if you're also stuck, you could try and talk to people you know and say, I have to explain this concept and I don't know how to, and someone who's willing to dialogue with you and say, oh, well, explain, if you can just explain the concept itself to someone you know who doesn't know the concept, you might find an analogy naturally coming up. That's how my student found the chess analogy, because when he was practicing his presentation on stem cells he was home for the weekend and he was hanging out with a young nephew about 8 or 10 years old and who was just starting to learn chess a little bit as of with the family that, and then he was practicing his presentation. He was talking to his nephew about it, and the analogy naturally started forming. So one of the ways to do this assignment to find it is to practice explaining and think about explaining it to a kid or a non-science expert or a friend or a romantic partner and see how the language starts naturally moving. Okay. Um, so this week is about relating and conveying scientific ideas through conversation or a conversation approach, which you hear me using that word a lot, maybe even in your feedback, even when you are just speaking to yourself in a room by yourself, such as I am doing right here, right now, that I am looking for this extemporaneous style, which is a very relatable style of getting information, as opposed to if I just decided to read the information to you. Rhetoric at its core deals with the profound influence of language. Unfortunately, rhetoric is often unfairly associated with mere empty talk or even deceit for some individuals. You might have encountered dismissive phrases like mere rhetoric, empty rhetoric, used to belittle a statement or opinion. However, rhetoric is far from being superficial or deceptive. It plays a pivotal role in shaping how we feel. Okay, so I'm just reading the Canvas page right now that I put up, and it's harder to listen to than someone who's speaking extemporaneously. So when I'm talking about relating and building a communication skill of extemporaneous, it means that you've practiced, it means that you know the concept, and then you throw away the script, you haven't memorized anything, and you start engaging in a dialogue format. Now, obviously, when you're doing these presentations and these forms, we're not in a true dialogue because no one can go, excuse me, can you go back and explain it? Just like I'm not in a true dialogue with you because I can't get your nonverbal feedback. You can't interrupt me. You could shoot me a question. On the Canvas inbox or something, but it's not the same as being in a true dialogue where we can ask questions. There's this idea of accountability in a dialogue, and accountability is like, oh, you. your nonverbals look like you are confused. You may not say it exactly like that, but you have some accountability to if you're paying attention to the other person in the way they're receiving a message, if they look offended or they look confused or they look lost, that you could take accountability, meaning like perception check. Hey, does that make sense so far? Or what do you, what's making sense? What's not making sense? Can I clarify something? And as soon as you ask something back like that, you allow the non-expert to engage with the material. And the more you can go back and forth and put yourself, an expert puts themselves into the role of leaning back into the listener piece of it, then you become someone who's learning what part of your information is actually getting interpreted in the intention, in the intent that you meant for it to be interpreted, right? We can only have intention, but there's a lot of unintentional things. And accountability is really being open to that piece of it and understanding when your message is not coming across. And I'm sure you've all had some teachers that stood at the front of the room and monologued and didn't seem to be in a dialogue with the students or interested in how the information was landing. Or if you were sitting in the classroom totally lost, you were in more of a monologue with an expert, non-expert trying to follow along. So when you're in a classroom where dialogue is encouraged, there is this discussion that starts to unfold that allows the teacher to move into also a learning place where they can better fine tune their message or the information they have so that it actually lands the way they want it to land. But you only know that if you can get some feedback, right? So there's listening and how we listen, whether you're the expert or non-expert, is really listening to understand. It's listening to be curious. Now, this is different than just this idea of active listening. There is active listening often is conveyed that you know how you active listen. You just nod your head and smile, but you can nod your head and smile and go, mm-hmm, oh, good, interesting. Hmm. And you could get pretty far through a dialogue and not really getting input, not really getting the message received from the other person and doing more selective listening or confirmation bias listening. But when we are this idea of being open as a listener, we are approaching the topic as if we don't know the topic, even if we're the expert. We want to approach that maybe something's happening uniquely in this interaction that I actually don't know what the person is saying, and I'm going to need to pay attention and dialogue so that I know. So that it's that type of listening that we want to. Now, that's hard to do because of the emotion piece that comes in, especially when if we're feeling frustrated or challenged and we're uh, sometimes when you're the non-expert, uh, you don't feel like we often can fall back into being into it, muting ourselves, being because of the authority feeling that comes from the expert talking. And there has to be a lot of work to set up norms in a dialogue so that the expert uh, is lowering the authority stereotype down and allowing the other person to have room. And that takes time. That's what relating is, where it's not going to all happen necessarily in one conversation. We might need a lot of conversations over a long period of time and building a relationship with expert to non-expert audience till we can be in a true dialogue. Um, I'll talk more about that. I also want to talk about in dialogue, the other thing that's happening is we need to know our purpose. We need to have a clear goal. Um, and an agreed upon goal. Sometimes we spend a lot of time because of our past experiences, either with that person or with other conversations on the topic, that we fall into our scripts and we have come in with expectations. And then our goal is, I don't want it to be like the last time, but each conversation is unique. So this isn't going to be like the last time unless you fall into this self-fulfilling prophecy of coming in so hard with your script that you're not really allowing for the other person to even show up and be different. So you have to be clear on your purpose. As an expert, your purpose, if you're moving into relating with a non-expert uh, conversation, is really to be inclusive. You're in service and you need to know where you're at with the other person. Where are they, where not just assuming, oh, they probably have no idea what I'm talking about. No, you need to explore that so you don't talk down or start with so much context that you lose them to the actual point that they're coming in. So you need to really be clear on expectations and be in service to the needs of the non-science expert listener. Oh, we also need to move beyond those emotional pieces that are usually defenses we've built up because of stereotypes or those pre conversations that we have these that are impacting us in the moment, those pre-memory feelings. So if you feel like you've always been dismissed or that your science isn't real or your I don't agree on your facts. I watched a video and I found out other information, so I know that's not true. Whatever it is you've been up to in the past, uh, sometimes we can come in really hard because we have this injury of not being heard, and that can undermine the process we need of building trust to build a dialogue to get the correct information out. Um, that brings me to this idea of ethos, pathos, and logos, right? Which is those tools of rhetoric, which I'm sure you have studied before. And here it is in a advanced communication class talking about science. And we kind of really need to understand how ethos, pathos, and logos work in engaging in relationship dialogue. Um, so ethos is credibility, and credibility is trustworthiness. It is uh, competency. Ethos is I basically, do we trust the information? Do we trust the person? Do we trust the source of the thing? And the thing about ethos is if someone doesn't trust you, someone doesn't trust you. If someone doesn't trust your science, someone doesn't trust your science. There's not a lot you can do, and you could be just like spinning your wheels in a dialogue trying to convey information. But if they don't trust, it becomes a really big thing to move beyond. And that's why sometimes when we're feeling like someone's not trusting our source, we start paddling our wheels into logos. This is a fact. This is evidence based, fact, 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 right? But if we have too much, that's logos. And when we bombard our audiences with one fact after another, that isn't going to, that's not going to build trust. And it also, if someone uh, is bombarded with too much logos, we lose the ability to, we move out of dialogue again. Boy, I'm not trying to make you feel like there isn't hope, but we need to understand how these three things work together. They don't work singular. Like if you just give fact, sometimes you end up in this like, well, here's the fact, here's the fact, here's the fact, here's the fact. It is a way to convince, that's not going to do it. But if you're just like, I don't trust you. I don't trust your source. I don't trust that you. I don't trust your source. I don't, that also is going to be a problem. And then pathos is also the emotion and the complexity of the topics we're talking about and the injuries that are sometimes around them, or how people live in fear or other or anger. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of fatigue that has, and self-righteousness that is also, when those things are used over and over again as a rhetorical technique to try and get someone to listen, people shut down as well. And so we need to know how to, if we want to be in a dialogue, we have to really come in very self-regulated. Just coming in with the passion of your topic is not going to be the solution to get someone to engage in relating over a scientific topic. So this is all going to be dependent on who you're talking to. The context drives everything, but science and communication gets really muddled when we're trying to navigate these complex ideas. So the chapter in Getting to the Heart of Science Communication this week really talks a lot about this. I'm trying to build on that. But when we are speaking in a dialogue to persuade, we have to realize that we're not going to change someone's mind overnight. It's not like people walk away from a conversation and go, I've changed my mind. Ding. Right? This is, unless someone is, most people change their mind when, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. Most people change their mind when they have interactions and information that have built up over long periods of time. And then there's a moment, a tipping point where and that's usually some emotion, their experience that have tipped them into looking at something in a completely different way. This is really frustrating because the scientific community is like ringing the bell and, oh, we're in the sixth mass extinction, and or we trying to get people, this hurricane we need to get people out of an area because of this hurricane or what is really causing and amplifying all these wildfires, and there's a lot of moving parts to why a scientist might be trying to ring the alarm bell to get action, uh, to get people to change their mind. So we want to think about how we're critically thinking and how we are building information and credibility over long periods of time and being consistent and reliable. And if we can stay regulated in our emotions, which doesn't mean you couldn't be upset about something. It doesn't mean that you can't be afraid. But if that emotion blows up the conversation, we move out of dialogue and we often move into summarizing and monologuing, defensiveness. And often if someone says, well, I can't talk to you, I don't trust you, we all of a sudden are in we start monologuing about why you need to trust me, and we move away from the purpose of the conversation. So these are all things to think about. This is a pretty complex topic, but when we study rhetoric, when we study semantics, when we know how to convey an idea to allow access to information, and we are not minimizing minimizing the importance of the topic, but also allowing for non-experts to be in dialogue and allowing their experience to be a part of the conversation. And this gets even more complex with indigenous communities, which have real injuries from the way science has been used to uh, to overuse resources or corral indigenous groups away from valuable land that was land that is an integral part of their culture, and in order for the gain of the dominant culture. So we want to think about how the injuries are sometimes deep, and how are we making room for uh, different cultural ways to solve problems, uh, and and combating stereotypes, the stereotypes of scientists, the stereotypes of non-scientist group, the stereotypes of politicians and public servants. Yes, that we have bad actors in some of these areas, but I would say the overarching group of people are not bad actors. They're there because of their passion, because of their commitment and purpose, to be in service to others, to be in service to public health. And when we allow stereotypes to decide about who people are, we get, we lose the ability to even dialogue even further. Okay, let's see. Achoo. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. Thank you. Um, one more thing is for a dialogue to be in a place of relating, we need to be in a team approach to the conversation instead of into an adversarial, my fact, your fact. Uh, this is what, and being in a competition and win lose. We want to pull the conversation into a team approach where we all want to win together. And that means that we want all those different ideas. We want to be listening and cooperative, and that means that sometimes there's conflict and sometimes there might be disagreements, but when we're on the same team, we agree on the problem and we've established norms in the conversation to move towards try, fail, try again, fail, try again, fail until we move towards cooperative solution ideas. Okay. Whew, that's a lot of information. I'm really looking forward to your approach to the metaphor assignment. We had some really creative things happening in the science, just science and kids shows. I really appreciate how you're diving into this topic. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.